Hey, Chris here from Sotera Media. Have you ever thought to yourself, that open field I saw could really use the spaceship from Flight of the Navigator? I know we've always thought it. Well, that's what we'll be doing today. We're going all in. I'm going to walk you through the 3D integration process we use here at Sotera Media. Using Blender 3.2 and Davinci Resolve Studio and Fusion Studio 18. This will serve as a broad overview for someone with these tools who's looking to dive a little deeper into VFX. It'll be pretty light and not all aspects of VFX will be covered, but this will give you a good starting point for getting more into it. If there are specific parts that you think could use more depth, let me know in the comments and maybe we'll make a video out of it. Real quick, today's tutorial is sponsored by, well, us. Sotera Media specializes in production in the greater central Pennsylvania area and post-production all around the world. We use industry standard hardware and software to bring your ideas to life. Visit swateramedia.com or send an email to hello@swateramedia.com to get in touch. Anyway, on with the tutorial. Alright, now let's get started, shall we? No, wait, this is probably going to be a long one, so I'd highly recommend a bit of coffee. I have mine here. It's homemade cold brew. It's awesome. I really enjoy it. Something worth noting, we are in Fusion, and that's for a couple of reasons. I feel like Fusion's interface is a little bit less busy, obviously, because it's just the Fusion tab, basically, from Davinci Resolve. So I think it'll be easier for everybody to see as the node tree gets a little bit bigger. It'll feel less condensed, but it's exactly the same thing, basically, with just a couple minor differences. Like in Fusion, we use a loader node to bring in footage. Here I have my TIFF sequence loaded in. Fusion tends to prefer image sequences over straight video footage. It's also a good habit to get into for doing VFX work. You always want to be working in image sequences. We also want to make sure that our frame format is set properly. Now this was 4K footage, but to save us a little time on the rendering end, especially in Blender, we're going to set it to, I exported it as 1080p, and the sample footage that I uploaded is also in 1080p, 23.976. Incredibly important to make these match between Fusion and Blender. So important. So make sure your frame rates are matching. Now to get to this point in, if you're working inside of just Davinci Resolve, we simply select our footage, click the Fusion tab, and we're in. Or you can right click and choose open in Fusion page. But like I said, obviously there isn't a huge difference, but I feel that Fusion is a little less, it's a little easier to kind of focus on what you're doing compared to Resolve. It's a shot by shot thing, so you won't be working on multiple shots within here. You'd ideally have well, I guess you could have multiple shots in one comp, but I like to have different comps for different shots that I work on. But anywho, so now that we've got our footage loaded in and set to the correct frame rate and all of that, we're going to go ahead and take a look at it and kind of get prepared to begin the match moving process, which is a great place to start. I think we're going to have a decent amount of luck with this footage. Now, the only thing that's a bother would be this car here. We only want to be match moving things that are stuck to the ground, that are not moving. Then we have a couple other cars up here, so we want to match that, or mask that out as well. That can be done simply by using, a polygon node or a ellipse or something like that, and do that inside of Fusion. We're just drawing a mask and moving it around. I have Mocha, so I like to use it. Even for simple stuff like this, it's just a little bit more straightforward. So I won't go to, definitely not going deep into Mocha today, but this will help us out, make it a little bit faster. Looks like there's another car up there. So for this, I'm just going to start one here. And I'm probably going to end up speeding this up. Now I'm jumping in here to note that do not do this, what I'm doing, when you're actually trying to do a planar track with Mocha. This works because we're just doing a garbage mat. But this would probably end up giving you really wild planar tracking results if you're constantly moving these handles. Awesome. So we now have our two track masks, or garbage mats, whatever you want to call them. And all these are doing is just cutting out portions of the scene so that way the camera tracker ignores it, because we don't want that motion. That is not stationary. Okay, so what we're going to do, and you should always label these, but we're not going to label these right now because this is a very simple thing. I'm going to copy it to clipboard. All right, so we just pasted those, and now we have our masks. Now they, of course, need to be inverted, so that way they're subtracting from our shapes. Then we got to merge these together, which is always an interesting thing. We'll come down here, and usually minimum works. There we go. What we're going to do now is close out that freaking keyframes window, and we're going to add in a camera tracker. We're going to plug our masks into the track mask input on the camera tracker. And we're going to plug our footage into the input. Now, this is essentially like DJI's version of log footage, so it's quite flat. It might be helpful to add a little bit of help for the camera tracker by just adding in some contrast. Maybe a little gain. Lower the lift a little bit. Just give it some more detail. Now you can also use things like unsharp masks, but I think we might want to do that. So we'll add an unsharp mask as well, just to bring out a little bit more detail. That should be enough. Cool. So now we'll come into our camera tracker itself. I'm going to turn off the second viewer here. Now, there are tons of tutorials out there that go more in depth into the camera tracker. But for this one, I'm going to assume you have a little bit of knowledge about it. I'm still going to explain everything that I do, but like I said, there's a lot of resources out there for understanding how this works. Now, what I'm going to do is just add a little bit more points. If your computer can handle it, it never hurts to have a couple more tracking points to work with. This also helps us understand the what we'll be doing in here, which I don't know what it is yet. You probably saw it in the intro, because the intro was probably recorded after this. I have no idea what we're making just yet, but we're going to figure it out as we go along. And I also like to use the bidirectional tracking. I think as far as our track channel, I think luminance is probably going to be fine. Blue might yield some good results, actually. Let's try tracking blue. Okay. And we'll go ahead and auto track. All right, right, so our track completed. Looks like we have a couple good points here, probably. So the next thing we'll want to do is enter our camera information. Now this is shot on a Phantom 4 Pro, so it has effective focal length of 35 millimeters. The aperture width, I had to look up, doesn't sound right, but we'll roll with it. Like 0.52 by 8.8, because I'm pretty sure that they don't have a preset for it. Yeah, that is not what we want. Cool. So that'll kind of start to help out the solve. Now, we ended up with quite a few tracks, so I'm going to start eliminating as many as I can. I have a pretty high track error. And I think I want to put something right here in the middle. So we want to try to preserve as many of these as we can. All right, and then we'll delete those. And now we'll go ahead and hit solve. All right, it's finally done, and oh, jankies, look at this. That is a very high solve error. Well, I think it's very good when things go wrong in these sorts of videos, so we can figure out why. And hopefully we can make it better. All right, so I think we have a bad track. So we're gonna go back. We're gonna delete that solve, reset this track. I'm going to switch to the Luma. What's interesting is I had actually successfully tracked a different version of this shot and got a very good solve error. So I'm not sure why this is happening for this one, but we'll dig into it and find out. Now, what I'm also going to do is I just reset the camera settings. And the reason for that is I think that the site that gave me the sensor width and height for the DJI Phantom 4 Pro, I don't think it was correct. So I'm just going to let Fusion try to figure out the camera without influencing it. Now we're also going to get rid of some points. I had a bad track error. Not too many. And we'll solve again. Okay, so the solve is completed, and now we're down to 2.8. Still pretty high. We want to try to work on that a bit. So we're going to slowly start to chip away at some of these points. I think I'm going to start at about there. Let's see if that's not too many. Okay, and we're solving again. So this is just a process of solving, evaluating where we're at with the solve error. I am aiming for about 0.5. We'll see if we can get there. And what we're doing is just filtering tracks that have a certain amount of solve error. We delete those and we solve again and see if we can get that solve error down. All right, so our solve is done, and wha-bam, 0.08. So you're looking for 0.5. So now looks like we have just a perfect track. And if y'all are having issues getting under 0.5, just keep slowly removing points with these sliders here, deleting them and resolving over and over. And you should eventually wind up at the same thing because we're using the same software. So, but if you have any trouble, let me know in the comments and I can give you even more advice. One thing you can also do that I learned that's really cool. This can be done. This should be able to be done with the planar tracker built into Fusion, but you can also do this with Mocha. That's how I learned how to do it personally. But it's pretty much the same concept. So what you'll do is, let's take a look at this footage one more time. I gotta see what stays in the frame. Okay. So what you can do in some cases, and this may or may not work, but it's one thing to look into, is we just draw a spline, especially wherever we need points to be. Now these points aren't going to be might not be as accurate, but if you're really struggling to match move a scene with a 3D tracker camera, what you can do is use Mocha to help assist. So I'm going to turn on perspective. Going to give it all the beans that we can, and then we track forward and backwards. And hopefully our planar track sticks. So I'm not going to track the whole thing, because this is just a quick demonstration. So now we have that planar track that's sticking really well. And this is especially nice. I actually had a shot that I was working on recently where the camera tracker was not having it. There was a lot of camera shake and a lot of motion blur. But planar trackers tend to be able to kind of cut through that noise and hold on even when there's, you know, a decent amount of motion blur. So that's holding on pretty nice. And what we can do, at least in Mocha, is go into the Insert tab and say we can do that. We can insert a grid. I had created a grid with points of my own that I ended up inserting, but it's the same kind of concept. Basically, you're giving the 3D tracker really, really sharp points to track. So now what you would do, and this can be done with the with corner pin with the planar tracker inside of Fusion itself as well, is you insert a grid of some kind. I used little green crosses for mine, but it's the same kind of concept. But then you feed this footage in that has this grid overlaid into it, and now you're feeding the camera tracker all of these nice little contrast points. So it's basically like, you know, you see in movies and, you know, behind the scenes and stuff, you see all the tracking markers all over everything. It's basically adding tracking markers to a scene, but after the fact. So you're giving it more things to latch onto. Now this should be used as a method of last resort, because the only problem that we're going to run into is if we want to create and add something to this scene, these markers are not necessarily going to accurately reflect the topology of this field here. So you want to use this sparingly. So you could even, you know, move it around and make it smaller and use bigger, you know, bigger checker board, something like that. And you want to absolutely make sure to match the perspective properly. Otherwise, this will be all for naught. So that's just a quick aside. So if you're having trouble 3D tracking a scene, you can use a planar tracker to help kind of supplement it. But you have to be careful to make everything match up perspective-wise. You don't want anything to throw off the track. So that's just a quick little thing that I had learned from the fabulous folks over at Mocha, or at Boris Effects rather. They actually suggested that, and it saved my scene. So let's go back in here. So we have a good solve error. Now, since we're going into Blender, I often just completely ignore the 3D scene transform, especially because the scale will be setting when we import the FBX into Blender. But you know, it can't hurt to try to align the scene nicely while we're in here. So for this origin, we're probably going to want to put our object to the middle of it, might be like here. So we'll set that origin point to that. This is the ground plane here. So we'll want to set that as our ground plane. And then the scale I'm going to set once we, actually, let's try to get a little close. Maybe 5. And then we'll switch back over to aligned, and we're going to export. So that way we end up with our 3D scene. Now, this is where I always like to work with the original footage. So we'll set that there. And let's switch into our 3D scene. It's looking pretty good. We see that camera moving around our scene. Pretty sweet. It's definitely a crane, not a drone. All right. So now what we want to do, I like to just kind of check out and see how it worked. See how things worked out. So we're going to switch to our camera view, right click in the viewport and switch to camera 3D. I'm going to make these points a little smaller. And I'm going to grab a point kind of close to where we want it to be. I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a shape. And it looks like it grabbed a bunch of points. So I'm going to delete most of these guys. There we go. And I'm going to plug this directly into the 3D scene. Now it's definitely off. So let's switch into our perspective view. Oops. And we're just going to move that up. Until it's on the ground, roughly. All right, and we'll switch back to our camera. And we're just going to play through, see how it looks. Turn off the point cloud for now. All right. Actually, so the best thing to do is to enable pass-through rather than just unhooking. And let's hit play and see how our cube is sticking to the ground. Yeah, I'd say with a track like that, we should be looking pretty solid. So that's what I would call a very, very successful solve. So now what we're going to do, so we want this point cloud to be in Blender. Ideally, it would be great if it was. But I have not been able to find a way to get this point cloud into Blender. There are some videos out there. There's one in particular that maybe I'll try to look it up and put it in the description, but it does not work for me at all. The method that he uses just simply does not work. I don't know if it's a version thing because it is a little bit of an older video, but what I've been doing recently to kind of combat this is simply, so we know that around our origin is where we want our 3D object to be. So we're going to grab a number of points in there. Now this can get a little tricky, so try not to grab too many, because what we're going to do is tell it to create a cube on each of these points of the point cloud. And those are going to transfer over into Blender and we'll use it for reference. Now we'll go ahead and create shape. This might take a couple moments. All right, so now we have about 1 million of these cubes. So I like to grab all of them and group them so that way our comp isn't totally insane. Then I just kind of put that under that merge node and we'll move it into the scene. I'm going to disconnect it from the point cloud and attach it directly to the 3D scene. So now we have just a bunch of cubes. But those are all spawned with the origin at the center of those points. So that'll help us out tremendously. So now let's move into Blender. So we'll grab an FBX exporter node. And we'll find a good place to put it. And we'll plug the output of our 3D scene into the input of the FBX exporter. We have our frame rate is correct, and we'll scale the units once we bring it into Blender. So we leave that as is, and we'll go ahead and render this out. Perfect. Now let's open Blender. We've got a new blend file here. First thing we'll do is save it because we don't lose our work. Now there's a couple of things we'll want to make sure of. Let's double check our scene settings. So for an animation, depending on what we end up making, 1200 samples is quite a lot. So we'll start low with something like 256 just to get started. We'll want to enable this little stopwatch next to seed under advanced. So what that's going to do is give the scene a unique noise pattern for each frame rather than the same noise pattern over and over again, which looks completely unnatural. And we want to be able to, we want to make things look as realistic as possible. Now, this is just a quick, fun little scene that we are using just to go through the steps. So we're not necessarily looking for something Hollywood level today, but this will help out with the realism because we won't want weird noise patterns messing with our viewers and making them think, hey, what's going on there? We want motion blur on. Now this camera attached to a crane was exposed properly for the frame rate. So the shutter speed wasn't too low or too high. So we'll leave this in the middle. So I don't like to use tiling because I think Cycles X performs a lot better when it doesn't have tiling happening. Now that depends on your computer because it does take a bit more resources to not use tiling, especially for bigger scenes. I don't think it'll tile on 1080p, but I always like to have that off just in case. For added, and when I'm doing animations, if you have the RAM for it, you can check persistent data, and what that'll do is kind of store as much of the scene as it can in RAM, so that way it doesn't have to load all of your 3D assets every time it goes to a new frame. So that can speed up the rendering and animation quite significantly. Now the next thing is our color management, because this is going to be important when we go back into Resolve for color. I like to use Filmic Log to get as much dynamic range as possible and keep that contrast high on Filmic Log, even though it looks pretty much like a log footage no matter what setting you put it on. And for the sequencer here, this isn't something that I'll be getting into because there are many videos out there. I'm going to switch this to Linear Aces CG. But Aces is just basically a color management system that just makes life a lot easier, especially when you're working either with a bunch of cameras with different color spaces and all that, and also when you're integrating CG elements into live action footage. Aces just kind of makes things a little bit easier. So we'll save and make sure that's good to go. I was trying to get screencast keys to work. I have it, but I'm not really maybe I need a newer version of screencast keys. Hey, look, we got it working. Yeah. Now I'm a real Blender tutorial person. Maybe we should make a donut. Maybe next time. As long as we don't end up being problematic on Twitter, am I right? Anywho, so there's a couple ways to do this next part. One way, if you do this a lot, if you end up needing to import FBX files quite a bit, one problem that you'll run into is Blender and Fusion use two different coordinate systems, where in Blender, Z is up, and in Fusion, Y is up. So that can end up messing with things a little bit. So there is a really great add-on called Better FBX Importer that I personally think is pretty worthwhile. It's like $30, but it saves you enough time that it starts to add up over time and really starts to pay for itself. But I'm going to do it the trickier way. which is using the native FBX importer inside of Blender. So we'll go to File, Import, and then we'll nav FBX, and then we'll navigate to our FBX file. Now we'll import it without changing the scale, just to kind of get a sense of where things are at. So definitely way too tiny. We want to try to get as close to real world scale as possible, and import again. I think we're going to go up to 80. Sweet. So that's looking pretty good. And now one of the things we'll want to do, and it looks like we got that ground plane set pretty nicely. I'm pretty happy about that. We want to grab all these cubes and kind of give them their own collection, because right now they're a little unwieldy. Select all of them and M into new collection. I like to just call it point cloud. So now we're able to collapse that, and it just makes life a little bit easier. Now there's a couple of things we need to do first. Let's start with the camera, because obviously this is a problem. It is not facing the right way. So we'll go up to Item. We're going to unlock these scale keyframes. Just go in here, right click, and hit clear keyframes. Now I always forget which ones we need to make negative, so I always just kind of go through. Okay, so that wasn't it. Oops, don't want to do that. Want to keep these values as they are, but it's okay to invert them. And negative 0.8. Now it's upside down. I think it was the X that we needed to ignore. Nope. I guess we just needed to do the Z. I always forget. That's why, that's the kind of thing that it's kind of annoying, that you would have to do every time you import an FBX. So that's why I just kind of caved and bought that add-on. Now this ground plane of theirs, we'll want to also hide, but I like to keep it around just in case. Now one thing we'll notice if we go into the camera view is it doesn't really line up, but that's okay. This plane here is actually a representation of the footage itself. So what we can do is match the camera's focal length to the width of this camera here, or this plane here, which is really easy. We'll go into the camera, go into focal length, and then I'm going to zoom in pretty close. We're just going to start adjusting this. That looks pretty right, but we're going to go in here and just make sure. So it is off a little, and that can really throw off our animation. Now, this is where you may need to get kind of granular. So let's start with 14.8. Okay, 14.85. That was a little too much. 8.3. 2. And 8.1. So sometimes it might not always line up quite perfectly, so we're going to add an extra decimal point here. 0.82. Let's add 4.83. Now we're good. Perfect. So now that lines up. Now another thing we'll want to do is scale these down quite significantly. So let's select our point cloud here. So we're selecting all the objects in there, and we're going to switch this from median point, which will scale the whole thing. We're going to switch that to individual origins. So now it'll scale along the origins themselves. Cool. Now we also notice that the end frame is incorrect. I forget how many frames this is. So we just hop over to Fusion again, 588. And we put that in there. Cool. And also, we'll need to make sure that our frame rate is correct. And that came over properly from Fusion. So now what we can do is add our footage as a background image. So I'm going to turn this off and let's go ahead and bring in our footage. So we'll go to the camera tab again, and we'll go to click background images, add image, movie clip, open. And here's our sample footage. Now that's a problem. I wonder what happened. Let's see if we can figure this out. I think our camera is not quite set properly. I think this does have to be negative. There we go. Now we're looking good. Now if you wanted to, if you were truly inspired by these cubes, you could just, have just a field of cubes and shade them in funny ways. I haven't quite figured out what we're going to put in the middle here, but I might just browse blend swap a little bit and see what they have. But that's looking great. So those cubes will tell us a number of things. So if we come in here, so the terrain is a little rocky, but for our purposes, I don't think we have to get too detailed, like with things like, say, a shadow catcher. We don't have to go too in depth. We see some of these are dipping down. So what you could do is basically subdivide the mesh and turn on proportional editing. Okay, bring that brush in a little bit, because those origins, the very center of these cubes is where the ground is. Now some of these might be a little off, but what you would need, and this is why would be very helpful to be able to generate a mesh inside of Fusion from the point cloud. But like I said, I have not been able to figure out how to do it. It doesn't, I followed the method perfectly that somebody shared in a video from a couple years ago, and it just simply does not work inside the current version of Fusion for whatever reason. So that's something that I've been researching a bit, but for our purposes here, we're going to be a little bit more loosey-goosey, just so you just understand the steps and perhaps a little bit about what the next level of this would look like, which would be creating some sort of mesh that more accurately follows these cubes here. But we're not going to do that for this one. I should note as well, another thing that we need to change inside the scene settings here is under film and then transparent. So that way when we go into rendered view, we're actually able to see our background footage. All right, so came up with a really simple idea. I think what we're going to do, because I've been watching and rewatching a bunch of videos from the person who actually partially inspired me to get into VFX, Captain Disillusion, and in particular, his Flight of the Navigator video is super cool. So I was actually able to find a model of the spaceship from Flight of the Navigator on blend swap. So I think we're going to play around with that. So we're going to come down to File, and this is I've included this in the project files if you're following along that way. We'll go in here and grab that. So we go to Append, and then we'll navigate to the project file, Flight of the Navigator, and that was made by a user named Mooney on blend swap. So we'll say thank you to them. Now, as often the case, things might come in a little big. So we'll kind of resize that. Looking at sample footage, it probably wasn't much bigger than this if we're looking at the movie itself. So let's bring that over here. Let's take a look. So I think we'll do is have it fall like that, and maybe put in a couple of SUVs like they were expecting it to show up or something, and have it come down and sit there and then shoot off into the distance. I think that'd be pretty fun. So we'll do it that way. Now, first things first, we'll want to get our lighting right, but first we'll bring in our models. So I also attached another one that has a Mercedes. Now this is going to be a whole lot. I'm going to select everything that's, I'm going to deselect things that aren't useful to us. We don't want the camera. We don't want any of the lights. Sometimes it's hard to tell what are lights and what are not. So what we'll do is we'll append that. And what I like to do is bring things just up and away from the scene. We want to delete that and that and that and that and that and that. Let's see if there are any textures. There are. Looks like some are missing, but we can fix that. Probably not going to spend like a ton of time texturing these. Literally probably going to give this like a kind of a rough, just regular principled BSDF. Let's see if we can, oh my gosh. Okay. We'll make a new one, just make it black because this is going to be far away. So things don't have to be like super detailed. And we'll give that a little bit more roughness. And then we'll apply that material, call it wheel. And what I'm going to do is first, I'm going to make a new collection for cars. And I'm also going to add in an empty so we can control it. I'm going to say Shift S, cursor to selected, Shift A, and we're going to add in an empty. I'm going to use a sphere for this one. And then we're going to drag all this, and that should do it. So what we'll do to kind of make this a little easier, we'll say cursor to world origin to put it back. We'll say Shift S, selection to cursor. There we go. Now the scale of this is going to be tricky, but what we can do is if we're set up correctly, we should be able to scale this down and fit it on that road. And that should give us the proper scale for the car. It's always nice to have reference. Now, let's bring this back over. We're still looking good on scale. And at this point, we can probably turn off our point cloud for both viewport. Oh, I accidentally put some stuff in that collection. So we want the cube, the plane, the empty. These all we want to put in the regular collection. So now we'll turn off our point cloud. And we're going to set this plane to be a shadow catcher. So we go into the object properties, visibility, and choose shadow catcher. Let's get a quick render. Now, we haven't set up our lighting, so it looks a little flat. So let's fix that. So what we want to try to do is use an HDRI if possible. So on Polyhaven, I was able to find one called Lillenstein looked pretty close to this field. So we'll go ahead and go over into our shader editor, switch to world. If you have Node Wrangler enabled on the background in the world, we'll hit Control T, and that'll give us all the nodes that we need. We'll load in Lillenstein. So it's starting to look better. Probably need to make this quite a bit bigger to accommodate the navigator. Now again, this plane is not accurately representing the topology of this field. That's okay for our purposes today. That's totally fine. Now, what we want to do is start matching these shadows. So if we look at our little like trash cans here, it looks like the sun was kind of behind us. So we want to adjust the shadow to match. So we'll come in here and we'll start rotating it. I think that's looking pretty all right. So we'll go ahead and duplicate. All right, so for an extra step, I thought, oh, also, I was able to get these to work-ish by just joining all the geometry together with Control J. It's not pretty. I should have applied a number of modifiers before doing that, but that's okay because it's far away and nobody will notice, right? Okay, so what I'm going to do for a little extra credit is create a light bar that undercover cops have. It's unclear if this will work out properly, but we'll see. And this is going to be super simple. Okay, so the way we set this up. We'll go ahead and give this a new material. And we're going to call this red. I actually have no idea how many lights are actually in a police car or the pattern which they flash, but I don't think that'll be terribly important for this particular endeavor. So real quick, set our emission to red. Actually, what we'll do is grab another material, call this metal. Make it black and metallic. And we'll assign all that to it. Okay. And we'll assign this one to red. And this one, come on. Just make every other one red. And now the way that we'll work this to get them to flash. So come in here. I'll add a math node. We'll switch that to greater than. Plug it into the emission strength. And we'll add in a noise texture. Make that one dimensional. And from the factor, we go down to the top value there. And for the W, hash frame, divided by 50. thank you to Default Cube for this one. Go into the red material and copy and paste. I'd say those should be a little visible. Now for the navigator. Let's say we wanted to hit the ground, hit the area here, maybe about 150. Let's turn the navigator back on, and we'll set a keyframe for that. And in the movie, it just kind of just goes down really abruptly. So we'll make those keyframes pretty close together. And immediately we'll have it start turning. And we'll probably have it rotate all around by there. And then just shoot off. And gain a little bit of altitude as well. Let's get next keyframe. All right, let's watch it back. Very simple, nothing too fancy. It rotates around, almost following the camera. It flies off. Very simple. Nothing crazy. Cool. Now, of course, since we're using an HDRI, we're getting these beautiful reflections in the navigator itself. Now, I think, looking at reference, I guess that's pretty spot on. Yeah. I think they pretty much nailed the material there. Just going to make this a little bigger just to be safe. Fantastic. So now we want to get into rendering. So the way that we'll do this is I typically by default, when I'm doing stills, I have a denoise node here. We're going to not use that, and we want to make sure our compositor is set to go straight from the render layers into the image, into the composite node. We'll want to make sure we have our render layers turned on. So I want to include, I just put them all on. I know it makes the files bigger, but I like having things around. But if space is a concern, the main things that we need are going to be our combined, our denoising data. We're going to need the diffuse, glossy, and transmission, and we need our shadow catcher. And those are the main ones that we'll absolutely need, but like I said, I like to include them all. And then we'll come into our output properties. We're going to choose a place for it, and we're going to switch this from TIFF or whatever the default for you is to OpenEXR multi-layer. And our color management is good. I'm going to find a place for this. Now you'll want to find a place that has a decent amount of storage. This can take quite a while, or take quite a bit of storage. So I want to put that in a folder. And that ought to do it. Just to double check, we have our, and we're going to turn off denoising in the render as well in here, because we're going to denoise it inside of Fusion. Make sure our Sobel's on, motion blur, our film is set to transparent, and let's get a sense for, I'm at 512 sample or 256 samples right now. Let's see how long it takes for that to render a frame. You'll want to use your GPU if possible, so just go up under Edit, Preferences, and System, and make sure that your GPU is selected. And if you have a NVIDIA card with it available, I always use optics because it's just so much faster. Let's see how this is doing. Come on. Cool. And it doesn't have to be perfect, you know. This is mainly in good fun and just learning the steps. So, you know, what we actually make isn't as important. So 44 seconds, I think. I'm going to take it up to 512, and that should be plenty. Now, if you notice, we're not seeing our shadows here, and that's because it's part of that shadow catcher render pass that will eventually hobble together in the actual comp when we bring all this stuff together. All right, I'm happy with that render time. And when you are as well, all you do is hit render, render animation. Alrighty, so our render is finally finished. For me, it took a couple hours. So now let's hop back into Fusion, and we'll work on getting our 3D assets into the scene. So I'm first going to drop down a merge node, because we'll be merging that footage on top of our regular footage. So connect that there. And that's our flat footage. Cool. And now what we'll do, and this applies to if you're working in Davinci Resolve as well, we'll open up a loader node, and we'll navigate to our sequence. So that should be it here. And that is not the first step. So what you'll want, and this applies to both, you'll need a plugin called Reactor. So this is the page that we want, and I will link this in the description, of course. Now, Reactor is a collection of add-ons for Fusion, and it's free. There are a lot of them there that will ask for a donation, and if you have an extra couple of bucks, I would recommend giving a few to the developers of these really, really fantastic add-ons. So what you want to do is download this Lua file, L-U-A, and then once that file is downloaded, you'll simply drag it from Finder on a Mac or Explorer on Windows into your node area here, and that'll prompt you to install it. Now, once it's installed, on Davinci Resolve, it's under Workspace and then Scripts. For Fusion, it's under Scripts, and then you'll see Reactor, and you just go to Open Reactor. Sometimes it just takes a moment. All right, and in here, we are going to want two specific add-ons. It's going to be OIDN denoiser, and we just check the box and that'll install it. and you want to just confirm, it sometimes pops up. And then if it asks you to restart Fusion, you can wait until we add the other one, and that's going to be HOS split EXR Ultra. And what that's going to do is automatically split our EXR file into its constituent parts for us, which is really awesome. So once you've got those checked, just go ahead and restart Fusion, and you'll be good to go. So the first thing we're going to want to do with our EXR file here, we're going to move it above to give it some space. Right click, script, HOS split EXR Ultra, and I like to have the nodes run horizontally. That's just me. I find that it's a bit easier. But then we'll just hit run and close. Cool. Once that's done, that'll close up. Now, this is all of those render passes that we're looking at inside of Blender. So what we're going to want to do is grab a few of those. And what we're going to do is assemble those render passes to end up at our combined image. So we have our diffuse direct, indirect color, glossy, transmission. We don't need we'll probably want to use the emission node because we have those police lights. Environment we don't want because we want our environment to be transparent, so we don't need to worry about that. And we'll also grab the noise nodes as well as our shadow catcher. So we'll go ahead and go through here. I also like to grab the combined. So grab shadow catcher, indirect, direct, transmission. There we go. Layer. I like to grab the composite combined, just so I have it as a reference. We need the denoising normal and albedo. There we go. And I just move them down so I can grab them easier. And here's our diffuse, our emission, and our glossy. So those are the ones that we want. So what I like to do, I don't like to throw these out once I have them. You can, if you're confident that you're not going to need them. But I like to keep them around in a little group that I hide way up in the corner, just in case I need it. So bring these in. And just for sake of ease, I like to move into kind of a space with a little bit of room because this set tends to get a little big. So if we reference our Blender render passes, which I'll add a link to this as well down below, we're adding direct and indirect and multiplying by color. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to grab, let's say we'll start with our diffuse, direct, color, and indirect. Let's bring these down. And the way we're going to combine these, there's probably a couple other ways. I learned it using channel booleans. So we'll go ahead and add those. So first we add the direct and indirect. And then we multiply the color. So we add, and then we're going to switch the alpha to do nothing. And then we connect that. And we connect these two channel booleans together, and this one we switch to multiply. So now we have our diffuse pass. Now it is a bit dark, and one thing we want to do, this changed. It didn't used to be this way, but it doesn't automatically add the alpha channel in. So you just have to go into each of these nodes here, and I just switch the alpha in them to the alpha from the combined pass, which is totally fine. There we go. Now we see our cars. They're a little dark, but we'll address that. And now we keep building. So we have glossy. We'll do glossy next. So I'm going to copy these two nodes and paste. And oops, it looks like we're running into our node tree, so we're going to move this up a little bit more. So we have direct and indirect and color. And this is kind of the same thing over and over again, so I'll probably end up speeding this up. All right, now that we have those set up, we have to go in, of course, and change that alpha. And now we're going to grab our emission, and I'm going to put this down here. And I'm going to copy one of these add booleans. And we're going to combine, we're going to add all of these together. Just like so. And then this, we'll add that one together. And then we're going to have a last one for, well, not last one, but almost last one for the emission. And we'll of course change that alpha over. All right, and let's check them out. Yeah, we can see our lights in the cars. That's pretty cool. All right, now the shadow catcher. So this one's kind of a special case. So inside a Blender, it's fairly straightforward inside of the compositor to add the shadow catcher to the scene. In Fusion, I haven't been able to find like a really clean way of doing it. No matter how much searching I've done, I simply cannot find a great way to integrate the shadow catcher. So what I'll do, we should be able to take a channel booleans and let's make that negative. Okay, so we'll disable these color channels. And now we have the alpha set to the shadow catcher. We're going to make that negative. So what we're going to do is use this as a matte for a background node. It's a workaround. So we'll use this as a matte and we should end up with our shadows. Again, it's kind of a workaround. I've been trying to figure this out for a while. I can't seem to do it, but I'll figure it out eventually. But this is a decent workaround for now. And so what we'll do with this is we'll then merge the rest of our scene over top of it. And now our cars have shadows, and so should our navigator. It's actually looking pretty nice. Probably would have wanted to add some surface imperfections to it, but that didn't really have any in the original film, so I think we're okay. Now what we'll do is finally use those denoising nodes. So what we'll do is grab our OIDN denoiser node, and we'll slap that down, and we'll plug this into the beauty channel, and we'll grab our denoising nodes. So up here is where the albedo goes, and down here is where the normal goes. So now let's see this. So I didn't end up with like a ton of noise, but just enough. It's always good to denoise it, unless you render at high enough samples that it's invisible, but that's not always practical, especially for indie people and, you know, people working on shoestring budgets. We can't wait forever for things to render. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to switch that denoiser node to pass through with Control or Command P, because that node is pretty, it uses up a lot of resources and can take a long time for it to refresh the scene. So until the final render, I always like to leave the denoising node turned off. So then we'll connect that to the foreground of our merge node. Now we've got a bit of a scene. Now I doubt we can get real-time playback. Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. That's okay. We can kind of click around, kind of check it out, see how it's looking. I'd say it's looking pretty good for something we just kind of cobbled together real fast. Now, of course, the color and lighting and all that is still off. That's something we're going to tackle next. Now, the reason why we work with all these nodes from this EXR file is that we're able to work on specific parts of the image separately. So if this is diffuse, direct, and indirect, so that refers to lighting that's being bounced onto our objects. And so with that, we can work on those separately if we wanted to. And you usually do want to. So for example, what I could do is grab a color corrector, put it in between, say, this channel here, and let's go in here. We say pre-divide post multiply when we're working with transparency. And now if we make changes to this, you see all that dynamic range? We can completely relight this, which is really amazing. And that's just affecting one aspect of the scene at a time. Now, this is just a quick overview of doing all this, of compositing. We're not going to get that in depth today. We're just going to have probably a single corrector at the end to kind of match the CG elements to the scene itself. But obviously you can get very, very detailed with it. You can go really far. Now here, what I'm doing is kind of comparing the shadows to these like trash can thingies here. And it's actually looking pretty darn close. So I'll probably want to keep the shadows pretty close to what they are now, but we might make a couple of adjustments. All right, so let's grab, I'm going to grab a single viewer here. And one thing you want to do too, because we'll probably come back to that, is you also want to match the color temperature of everything, and that shadows are, it's important to match the temperature of the shadow as well. I mean, there's a million different things that you have to do to get these kind of looking similar. I mean, this sort of work can take hours and hours and hours and hours, but we're going to kind of move through it a little faster. But hopefully you can see areas where you can take more time to really tune things in. All right, so let's start. We're going to pre-divide, post-multiply. And let's just start getting our basic colors right. Actually, for this, I'm going to turn on the denoiser. Hopefully we'll get quick updates. Also want to check and see, so these are black. We want to make sure that they're looking right. And we can also hold down Shift inside here to make small corrections. I didn't have any real reference for the black level, but that's okay. And I think those cars are too small. Looking at them, well, maybe a little too small. I can't remember if this path can, how wide this path is. Typically, you would have a lot more reference to work with. Hopefully. Hopefully. Not always. Now here's where I would probably going to want to bring down that glossy a little bit. It's a little hot. So I'm going to add a corrector to this node here. And let's come down. And I'm going to, inside of this second corrector, of course, pre-divide post multiply. And I'm going to come into the highlights. I'm just going to try to, oops, don't go too far. Just kind of ease it down a little. I think I might actually go back into master. You always want to work big to small adjustments. Now this is a reflection of the environment. I think I might want to try to lift that a little bit. Let me try to find where that is most apparent. There we go. Cool. So here's where we're going to add another corrector. Now this is where things start to get a little cramped. So you'll often want to kind of spread things out a bit so that way it doesn't get too confusing to look at. So this, we're going to come into the, we should be able to do it with the shadows. And we'll always, I wish they could make that the default. If anybody knows how to make this on the default, please let me know. And we don't want that much of a change. Maybe about, I want to kind of try to match those shadows in the background there. Because that's what it's supposedly reflecting. That's worth pointing out. You know, I'm always learning. So if there's anything you see here that's just really, really stupid, and you're like, oh, you should do it this way, just let me know. I'd love to know, and I'm sure other people would want to know too. That's definitely worth sharing, always. Let's check out some other frames. Now we do have some reference, a little bit of reference for the cars, which is this car back here. So that looks a little bright. So we actually probably want the gamma to be pretty, the gain to be pretty high. So I'm going to make that a global change. Okay, I think we're getting pretty close. Like I said, we're not going to take a ton of time on this. Now, one thing that I'm noticing, these shadows are a little hard. So we should be able to add a blur node. Just soften them, not that much. Let's say 1, see how we're looking. Maybe 2. Yeah, that looks a little bit more natural. Now what's really fun is we did all this work up here to denoise it. Now one of the things that we didn't do is add any depth of field, because I wanted to do that in here. Now if we notice, not much of this is in focus. So we're probably going to add a little bit of defocus to our image. Not quite that much. Because lots of cameras are really, really sharp. But not the drone. A lot of times this isn't very sharp, and that's probably me using a bad f-stop. I was probably way too wide open when I was filming this. We can always sharpen it later, but what we're going to do is also, let's look at our footage. There's definitely some noise. So counterintuitively enough, we'll actually want to add some noise into this. So let's add some film grain. That's obviously way too much and way too big. Let's make the size pretty small and the strength very subtle. Just enough. Now I think it's a good point to just try out, a quick render, see how it's looking. So we'll want to drop down a saver node if you're inside of Fusion, or if you're inside of Davinci Resolve, you'll just want to go to your deliver page and render out a quick preview. Now we'll go into the settings real quick. So Navigator test 01, just want to kind of see it in motion. And now by quick, this might not be very quick because it has to process all of those render passes. So this might take a little bit to render. And in Fusion and also in Resolve, ProRes 422 I like to use. Inside of Resolve, you can go to H.264. It's just that Fusion doesn't really care for it, so I have to go out to something that Fusion will like. So we'll go ahead and render. And in my case, you can do this too. I'm going to render it at half size, which is less than HD. Alrighty, so my render completed, took about an hour. But let's check it out. Not too shabby. The tracking's good. I'm seeing that characteristic warble that's often associated with not enough samples. So I think probably should have used a few more samples. So ideally, for a finished scene, you're going to want to use a lot more samples, and that can either come from just upping the samples, or if your hardware can't really afford that, you can always look into options for render farms, which there are a couple that are available that aren't too expensive, and we might be able to take care of a little bit of that with some of the noise reduction in Davinci Resolve, but we'll kind of see. But otherwise, it looks very good. So you should pat yourself on the back. We've created a 3D integrated scene. Okay, so the next step, because I think we're looking pretty good, is to bring this into Davinci Resolve and give it a little bit of color, and then that'd be it. Now for this purpose, whenever I export a final image, to move it into the color phase, I like to preserve as much as possible. So I'll use ProRes 4444XQ to preserve as much of that color data as possible. You could probably get away with regular ProRes. This will take up quite a bit more space, but I like to preserve as much as humanly possible. All right, so let's get this ready. We'll render, and this time we'll hit final and say start render. So I slapped a quick grade on the footage, and let's see how it turned out. So that's it. This was a long one, I know. Thanks for sticking around. As always, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, consider subscribing. Take care.